Woohoo! Aww. Woohoo! Hello and welcome to another episode of games I probably wouldn't have bothered with if they weren't leaving Game Pass soon. As you may or may not remember, but probably don't, the last game I looked at that fitted into this category was Apocalypsis, a not particularly interesting little point-and-click adventure. And while I don't regret playing that game, I definitely wouldn't have regretted not playing it either. But the game I'm looking at today is a very different story. This is Metro Exodus, and I'm very glad that I took the opportunity to play it now, as I would have been missing out on a damn good game if I'd let it pass me by. Actually, the only downside is that I've had to play it before I got around to finishing off the first two games in the series, Metro 2033 and Last Light. I've had both of them sitting on my hard drive for years now, but I've never found time for them. I don't think my enjoyment of Exodus was hampered too much by not having played the earlier games, but it is a direct sequel with many of the same characters, and given how important those characters are to the overall game experience, it would definitely have been nice to go into the game with more knowledge of their history and experiences. Oh well, not much I can do about that now, except go back and play the earlier games out of sequence, which I am definitely more motivated to do now. In any case, I came to Metro Exodus without knowing too much about it. I knew it was set in post-apocalyptic Russia and that it had more open-world elements than its prequels, but apart from that I went in pretty much blind. So let's get started. Right away, this is a game that makes an impact. The presentation is truly phenomenal. Even this pre-title screen cinematic is highly evocative, with its stark imagery and melancholy music. The title screen itself is also surprisingly cool. It positions you within the cabin of a train, which may not seem entirely relevant at first, but its significance soon becomes apparent. Furthermore, this setting evolves as the game progresses. If you come back after each chapter of the game, you'll see that things have changed to match the events you've witnessed. The intro movie is likewise train-themed, and I think it's also highly effective. Through the windows you see a series of vignettes that run through the tragic history of war and destruction that have led to the current state of the world, from the apocalyptic bombing to the rise of a new and troubled life underground. It's a fantastically succinct and evocative way of setting the scene, and honestly I think it would have been even better without the narration, as the visual storytelling is more than sufficient. Eventually you get control of the main character Artyom as he descends into the sewers after an excursion above ground. This first section is your standard tutorial level for the 3% of people who have never played a first-person shooter before, as well as a mood setter, and it's effective in both regards. It's dark, it's silent except for the skittering of spider legs and the ominous groans and laughter of unknown origins, and there's death everywhere. And right away we can see just how finely crafted the visuals are and how well suited the graphics are to a game of this type, where darkness and grime are central themes. The texture resolution isn't super high, but the environmental design is great, and the lighting, oh man, the lighting. Now my PC is a long way from new, and I don't have a video card capable of ray tracing, but even without it the lighting in Metro Exodus is amongst the best I've ever seen. And I mean that from both a technical and aesthetic standpoint. Lighting can be dim and subdued, or warm and inviting, or cold and stark, but no matter what it is, it always serves both the mood of the environment and the mechanics of the gameplay. Both light and dark can be either your friend or your enemy. Light exposes you, while darkness can let you creep around unsuspecting prey, but of course your foes can do the same thing, and some of them are very good at making you the prey instead. In any case, even without ray tracing, the lighting seems natural and as close to realistic as you'd hope for in a game like this. Another thing the game does well is jump scares, like this one here. And yeah, I guess the effect is somewhat diminished if I warn you before they show up, but I'm more of a warm, cozy, nice cup of tea with a quilted blanket on your lap kind of gaming channel, and quilted blankets are a bastard to clean if you wet yourself with fear. Trust me, I know. But actually the jump scares in this game are really pretty good. For one thing, they're not overdone, they only appear once in a while, so you never become acclimated to them. For another thing, the animation and character models are really well done, so there's a genuine visceral horror at play when some mutated abomination is trying desperately to eat your eyeballs. Of course, when the monsters are up this close, that's when you might notice that the texture detail is a little lacking, but thanks to the lighting and the animation, the denizens of darkness still look solid and real, usually disturbingly so. The brief tutorial section culminates in this scene, and I'd say it's a great example of everything the game does well in microcosm. The monstrosities creep out of the shadows, too great in number to be overcome, so you turn and grapple with the door as the game goes into another first-person cutscene. Normally I'm not a huge fan of non-interactive cutscenes like this. It can be frustrating to find yourself no longer in control, but this game handles them well enough that they make for genuinely engaging viewing, even if the action is taken out of your hands. Well, usually anyway. You regain control of Artyom back in the relative safety of the more civilized section of the metro, and meet the game's two most important characters, Anna, your wife, and Colonel Miller, her father and the commanding officer of the Spartans, of which you are a member. These characters were also in the previous game, and no doubt I would have had more attachment to them if I'd played it, but honestly, this game does a good enough job of creating a sense of attachment by itself. And again, I was struck by just how well constructed these characters are in a technical sense. Other games have featured characters with more polygons and more sophisticated facial animation, but the characters in Metro Exodus are crafted with enough care and artistry that, when coupled with the game's highly effective lighting, they're appealing and expressive while remaining on the right side of the uncanny valley.
There's only Metro, nothing else, and the Order is here to defend it, because if not...
This is best exemplified by this scene in which Artyom rejoins his fellow Spartans. This band of brothers might at first seem like an indistinct mass of testosterone and rampant masculinity, and that's, not an inaccurate assessment, but as the game goes on you'll find that some real heart has been put into these characters. And the phrase band of brothers really is fitting, as Metro Exodus does a better job of creating a bond of camaraderie between its main cast than just about any game of recent memory.
Alright, you're all dismissed. I give you 2 hours, people.
Of course, the bonds of camaraderie need to be forged in the fires of hardship, to coin a cliche, and although I've got to believe that living in the ruins of the Moscow metro system is hardship enough, there's more to come. A week later, Artyom and Anna are back on the surface. Artyom is convinced that, contrary to common wisdom, there are survivors of the apocalypse outside of Moscow, and is determined to make radio contact with them, much to Miller's chagrin. Anna is more sympathetic, to the point of at least accompanying Artyom on this excursion, but is nevertheless convinced that the outside world is a lifeless wasteland. They don't detect any radio signals, but this time they do happen upon something new, a train chugging its way through the frozen dead world. Before they can even think about mounting a pursuit, however, they're picked up by fellow soldiers. It happens that these soldiers have also detained a pair of outsiders who confirm that there is indeed still a world going on outside Moscow. What a stunning revelation! Everyone in the metro will be overjoyed to hear the news. Well, no. Unsurprisingly, things don't turn out quite that simple. The soldiers train their weapons on the outsiders, Artyom intervenes, and after punching a dog in the face, cops a bullet to the chest for his trouble. But somehow he's not dead. Unlike the 2 outsiders, they're definitely dead. Definitely very dead. Just like all the other inhabitants of this corpse pit Artyom finds himself in. But now you've got yourself a goal. Rescue Anna and find out just what the hell is going on. And this is where the game starts in earnest, and you get your first taste of what to expect going forward. There's a heavy emphasis on stealth and exploring the environment to find ways to get around without alerting your enemies. And I'm not generally a fan of stealth in games. My lack of attention span means I tend to get bored if I'm not exploding a skull every few seconds. But the stealth in Metro Exodus is an organic part of the gameplay in a way that makes it feel natural and satisfying to creep about. You don't need to meticulously map out patrol patterns. You don't need to painstakingly extinguish every light source in a 500 meter radius. You just have to stick to the shadows, move silently when required, and basically be a lethal badass commando. And if that fails, which it often did for me, what with my daughtering, then you've usually got a decent arsenal of less subtle tools at your disposal, tools with an instruction manual that reads simply, point at the thing you want to die, then pull the trigger. In most games like this, gunplay would be my first and possibly only line of offence, but in Metro Exodus I usually felt inclined to try the stealthy option first. Usually, not always. So, you make your way through the enemy base, although at this point you're still not sure how and why these people are now your enemies. As far as you knew up to a few minutes ago, you were essentially separate branches of this apocalyptic world's version of the military, and ostensibly working towards the same goal, but it turns out things are kind of complicated. But they've got your wife, and that's enough motivation for murder for now. Plus, they're trying to kill you. That's also helpful. You come across Yermak, an old engineer who's been locked up because he still has the remnants of a conscience. He guides you to Anna, and when you find her, you also find out two other little nuggets of information. Firstly, the reason the airwaves have been dead in Moscow is not because the rest of the world has been annihilated, but because there are powerful radio jammers in operation. Secondly, Miller knew all about this. The implications are troubling to say the least. For now though, the main priority is escape. Yermak guides Anna and Artyom to a train, which they're able to get moving, for about 2 minutes, until they are apprehended by Miller and the rest of the Spartans. Miller is obviously deeply conflicted by all that has transpired, but concludes that the best thing to do now is just to get out of Moscow, to exodus, if you will. Wait, what's the verb form of exodus? Exodize? Exode? Is there even one? Whatever. First though, you have to shake off pursuit from another train. And yes, the notion of two trains playing a game of cat and mouse is kind of implausible. Unless you have Grommet-like track building skills, you just have to hope you've got several miles of adjacent track. So it's kind of ridiculous, but damned if it isn't a pretty awesome set piece, as you leap over to the other train and plant a bomb in its furnace. I avoid killing the stoker, but he then leaps out in front of the other oncoming train, so I gotta assume that my mercy only let him have maybe 10 seconds more life. With the enemy train out of the way, you're free to make good your escape. And thus ends the first episode of Metro Exodus. That really is the right word, as the game basically has an episodic format, with each episode taking place in a different location and at a different time of year. Yes, this will be a lengthy journey for the Spartans. These episodes are linked by interludes that take place on the train, and that train essentially becomes a character in and of itself. It even gets a proper name, Aurora. As the game progresses and events unfurl, it becomes more and more like a travelling home for the Spartans, and my favourite moments of the game take place within its narrow confines. This is where you get to interact with your travelling companions, where you get to see the humanity behind the trained soldiers you've been working with. The first of these interludes allows Miller to offer a justification for why he never told his subordinates about the radio jamming in Moscow. He claims that the war didn't actually end when the bombs dropped 20 years ago, that Russia is likely still occupied by enemy forces, and that radio silence was necessary to make the invaders believe Moscow was a lifeless husk of a city, and therefore not worthy of their attention. Which is plausible enough, at least by video game standards, and fits in depressingly well with Soviet standards of paranoia and deception. It might be worth noting at this point, for those unaware, that the Metro games are based on a series of novels by Russian writer Dmitry Glukhovsky, and the studio chiefly responsible for their development is 4A Games, founded in Ukraine, though no longer based there, thanks to the rather complicated geopolitical climate in the region. So there's a real authenticity to the Eastern European world of Metro, and although I personally am an outsider to that world, it still rings true in a way that many other game worlds do not. Anyway, the Spartans agree that Miller's dishonesty was regrettable but necessary, and basically put it all behind them when they pick up a radio broadcast giving coordinates to something called the Ark Project. With newfound optimism, Miller latches onto this beacon of hope, and the comrades decide to head in that direction. There's a bit of a hiccup along the way though, because, video games. As they approach the Volga River, they're shot at by the locals, who by some miracle manage to, quote, pierce a cylinder. I'm not sure just what this particular cylinder does in train anatomy, but apparently it's kind of vital, because the Aurora is now out of action. To complicate matters, it seems the enormous bridge over the Volga is now more of an armoured citadel than a bridge, and the inhabitants aren't very hospitable. So it's up to you to sort out this mess. And so begins Chapter 2. I don't think it's accurate to define Metro Exodus as an open world game. It doesn't have the vast unified game world or the countless side quests and characters and locations that are implied by that definition. But what it does have is a series of large, non-linear areas with various points of interest and occasional bonus objectives for those that dare to track them down. Maybe that's enough to make it an open world game in your book, and that's understandable, but to me it doesn't have the epic scale that is required to earn that appellation. And I absolutely don't mean that as a bad thing. On the whole, I think the environments are just the right size, large enough to be interesting for both combat and exploration, but small enough to keep the game focused. And they're crafted with an attention to detail that might be lost in anything bigger. The game may take place in wastelands, but even so, no space is wasted. The major landmarks are large, intricate, and make for some compelling exploration, but even the more minor areas, the collapsing shacks and bandit outposts and the rusted hulks of ancient railway carriages, are constructed with care and are worth exploring as well. Actually, exploration is always a worthwhile activity because you'll want to be collecting as many resources as possible to fuel the game's crafting system. It's relatively simple stuff. Opening abandoned lockers and long-forgotten suitcases yields resources that allow you to create ammunition and health packs, upgrade your weapons in small but significant ways, and, crucially, clean and repair your weapons and equipment. Weapons degrade over time, and your gas mask can get cracked if you have it equipped during combat, so resources need to be spent to maintain their effectiveness. It was never a huge issue in my playthrough, but apparently on the harder difficulties, just keeping your weapon clean and functional can be one of the game's biggest challenges. If you look carefully, you might also find more substantial upgrades that can't otherwise be crafted, like night vision goggles or increased ammo carrying capacity. Plus there's a standard array of collectibles like postcards and audio tapes, the sort of thing you've probably tracked down in 1,000 games by this point. Anyway, the nearby church is your first target, and it seems to be the most likely spot to find friendly, or at least non-murderous locals who can help you understand the local situation, and maybe suggest a way to get over the bridge unmolested. It turns out your hopes of finding friendly folks is a forlorn one, but they're not exactly murderous either, at least not right off the bat. What they are, in fact, is a technophobic cult who try to imprison you while they figure out how best to deal with this newly arrived heretic. They've also imprisoned a woman named Katya and her young daughter Nastya, who seem to have been treated well enough so far, but since the cultists believe Katya summoned you and the other Spartans with her witch magic, it's probably best for all three of you if you don't hang around longer than necessary. So you set about escaping, and this section is a real highlight, to my mind at least. The church is a large, dilapidated structure with plenty of hidey holes and poorly lit passageways, perfect for a bit of stealthy murder. But I like to try for a minimum of benevolence, so I go for exclusively non-lethal takedowns. This means no gunplay, but the cultists don't exactly seem to be an elite military force, so I actually managed to take them all down without killing anyone. Well, I mean, some of these supposedly non-lethal takedowns look kinda brutal. You can't tell me no one's sustaining a fatal skull fracture or spinal injury, but as far as the game's concerned, my conscience is clear. And as it turns out, my tender mercy will have an impact later on. You manage to get back to your boat, but on the way back to your comrades, you're ambushed by the Tsarfish, the object of the cultist worship. It's not actually a Tsar, but it is actually a fish, a catfish by the looks of it, and quite a large one. You survive, of course, and meet up with Duke, and this might be the right point to recommend playing this game with Russian or Ukrainian audio, unless you really have an aversion to reading subtitles. The English voice acting is, well, I honestly can't tell if they're bad performances or just bad accents. But I just find the Russian or Ukrainian options less jarring, and they lend the game another touch of authenticity. Honestly, not all the English voice acting is bad, but this guy, Duke, leaves something to be desired.
I'd hate to come back to Moscow without even firing once. I was trying to win a girl over from one trader. Tough luck there.
And actually, that said, at times these subtitles are pretty dodgy too, as they're rife with typos, spelling errors, and dubious translations. Anyway, you get back to the train, and Katya reveals that there's a mechanic named Crest holed up at the nearby port, and thanks to the sort of coincidence that is acceptable in video games but basically nowhere else, he has the particular expertise required to get the Aurora up and running again. So you head off to recruit him to your cause. This gives you an opportunity to take in a bit more of the surrounding environment. It's a grey and bleak place, made unnervingly beautiful by the game's excellent rendering engine. The environmental effects truly are brilliant, and when it starts raining you can almost feel the icy water slapping into your face. Even better is the gradual transition from night to day and back again. You really feel like you're part of a genuine living world, even if what's living in it is usually monstrous. You make your way to Crest, and he agrees to help you out once you take care of a minor mutant infestation. So, mission accomplished. But on the way back you encounter Anna, who's fallen into a disused bunker and got a lungful of healthy, life-giving gas. No, wait, the other sort of gas, the deadly kind. She's not dead yet though. In fact, once you get her out of there, she seems basically fine. For now. Dramatic foreshadowing alert. Once you're back at the Aurora, Katya, along with Stepan, who seems to have taken a shine to the newcomer, convinces Miller that maybe the train would benefit from the addition of a passenger carriage, and it just so happens that Crest knows where one might be found. It's currently home to a swarm of bandits though, so you know where this is going. Before that though, there are a couple of other things you might want to take care of. I said this game doesn't have countless side quests, but it does have a few little missions to undertake if you feel like it. Stepan, for instance, has heard the bandits playing a guitar, and he wants you to liberate it for him. And the girl, Nastya, asks you to retrieve her teddy bear, which, for no other reason than video game logic, was stolen by one of the giant winged beasts that have made their nest nearby. Whether or not you can be bothered with these side quests, eventually you're going to have to deal with the bandits currently in possession of the passenger carriage. You've got the option to infiltrate their lair stealthily, and I did try that, honest, but I was spotted pretty damn quick, whereupon the whole swarm rose up in anger against me. So it's slaughtering time. And now that I'm fully committed to it, it's worth saying that the gunplay in this game is pretty solid. It's not remarkable by any means, but you've got a reasonable array of weapons to work with, and the enemy AI is sufficiently advanced to at least make it feel like you're not fighting total morons. Well, on this difficulty there's not a huge difference between enemy combatants and semi-sentient scarecrows with watermelons on their heads, but higher difficulties present a reasonable challenge. And the watermelon metaphor might seem a little odd, but the thing is it's rather satisfying to get headshots in this game. Enemies' heads don't quite blow apart in the same way that a watermelon might if it was suddenly introduced to high-speed ballistics, but the effect on your foes is pretty much the same, as one good headshot is enough to fell all but the mightiest of opponents, or the ones with decent helmets. As for the guns, the selection on offer is small but refined, and each weapon can be modified to focus on different elements, for instance range or reliability or ease of use. You've got your standard machine guns and revolvers, and a less standard sort of shotgun/pistol hybrid, and of course a sniper rifle. Perhaps the most interesting though is the air rifle, which is more lethal than you might think, with the added bonus of being a damn sight less noisy than most other guns. Plus, when you get the fire cartridge upgrade a little later, it becomes the weapon of choice for pyromaniacs as well. Once you've liberated the passenger carriage, you still need to get it to the Aurora, and that requires the use of a motorised railcar. There happens to be one nearby, which is fortunate, but it currently resides in the old Refinery, which is now home to the aquatic beast known as the Czarfish, which is less fortunate. But you really need that railcar, so that's where Artyom goes. Having just come from butchering a bunch of bandits in rather intense combat, this next section in the Refinery represents another side of Metro Exodus, the creepy and occasionally downright horrific side. The enemies here are mostly the same sort of humanoid zombie-like mutants you've encountered before, and they go down with a well-placed headshot like everything else, but the environment here is dark and foreboding, and the mutants rise up from the filthy water like malevolent leeches. It's a great part of the game, it's genuinely tense. However, this was where I experienced the first of several issues that very nearly made me give up on this game altogether. You see, having made my way to the end of the section and found the railcar I needed, I then made the catastrophic error of jumping back down to a lower area of the Refinery, basically back to where this section started. And then I seemed to be stuck. You see, on my first trip through this place, the Czarfish had knocked out a walkway, and now, without it, I couldn't get back up to the railcar. But nor could I go out the way I'd come in, as the boat I'd used had dematerialised somehow. There was a locked door, and a Google search informed me that if I'd had the necessary key, I could have used it to access the area with the railcar. But I didn't have it, I'd missed it somehow, and I sure as hell couldn't get out to track it down now. This might not seem like a huge deal, just load an earlier save and I'll be fine, right? Well, for some reason Metro Exodus has very limited saving options. You have 3 autosaves and a quick save, and that's it. You can't manually save. And the game loves to autosave, so much so that all 3 of my autosaves were overwritten after I got stuck. And I'd foolishly quick-saved after I jumped down, but before I'd realised that I was irrevocably screwed. Or at least so I thought for a while. But once again it turns out I'm an idiot, and I'd actually quick-saved just before I jumped down. So I was able to salvage the situation. But I still have to call this some pretty bad game design. If I'd hit that quick save button just a little later, I'd have had no option but to restart the chapter and lose hours of progress, which would have sucked. And yes, maybe I'm missing something obvious, maybe there was an easier way to get back to where I needed to be. My stupidity knows no bounds, so it's a distinct possibility. But if there was a way out, I just could not find it. And whichever way you slice it, it really would be nice to manually save to different slots. Anyway, with that sorted out, I can now get the railcar to the passenger carriage. And then, another hiccup. Okay, this one's mostly on me, but I still thought for a moment that the game had broken again. For some reason I assumed you needed to move the carriage through the other side of the shed, which was still blocked. So I went back to the train, thinking I maybe needed to trigger some sort of scripted event. But everyone was just standing there in ominous silence, peering out into the darkness. I honestly found this creepier than just about anything else in the game, and not just because I had the sinking feeling that I was going to have to restart the chapter after all. But eventually I realised it was just my idiocy at play once more, and all you need to do is take the passenger carriage along a different set of tracks and back to the train, whereupon everyone there breaks out of their deathly trance. So now it's time to take over the bridge so we can get the Aurora over the Volga River and onto our destination. This section is very much like the church from earlier, except it's larger and more heavily populated. Nevertheless, at this early stage of the game I'm still feeling motivated to keep up the stealth approach, and I miraculously succeed. Well, right up until literally the last moment when I accidentally knock a guard down a flight of stairs while performing a non-lethal takedown. Which I guess may have proven lethal. But hey, it was gravity that killed him, not me, so my karma remains stainless. And this turns out to be important. Even though everybody in the place now knows where I am, I managed to get to Solantius, the High Priest, before they get to me. And because I haven't killed any innocents, he grudgingly lets the train through without causing any more trouble. Apparently, if you have killed too many of his flock, they start shooting and Duke dies in the ensuing chaos. And since his voice acting is easily the worst, maybe I should regret not taking this chance to get rid of him. But in all seriousness, I don't. I would have been genuinely miffed to lose any one of my band of brothers along the way, even Duke. I know Metro Exodus is far from the first game to include narrative differences like this based on your choices, but something like this is more impactful than most. And mainly that's down to the skillful and thoughtful way all the characters are designed and presented to the player, and the emphasis that is placed on the concepts of home, togetherness, and safety. To lose even one of the Spartans would have caused a pretty major rift in those concepts, and I would have felt there was a huge gap amongst the ranks of my comrades later on. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Any narrative choice that has a significant emotional impact in the game is to be applauded, and if I'd lost Duke now, apart from being emotionally effective, it would actually have provided a pretty compelling reason for me to play through the game again, and I very rarely play through a game like this twice. This time around though, Duke survives, and the game moves on to the next interlude. The Aurora has a passenger carriage now, and it makes a world of difference. The train is a much more pleasant place to be, and its inhabitants are settling in nicely. There is some great character interaction to be witnessed here, with the Spartans sitting around, relaxed and at peace, just shooting the shit, to coin a phrase. If you found Nastia's teddy bear in the previous section, it's there too, and if you found a guitar for Stepan, you get the chance to jam with him for a while. And actually, I don't know what this music is, but it's just perfect for the moment, and for the world around the characters. It's melancholy but rather beautiful, and just sitting here and listening to it may be the most emotionally resonant moment in the entire game, for me at least. but I'm always easily moved by music. When you've had enough of soaking in the atmosphere, and there really is a hell of a lot of atmosphere to soak up, you can head to Miller, who plays a taped radio conversation he had with Major Ivanov, who claims to be Deputy Chief of Communications at the Ark. Now, most of the writing in Metro Exodus ranges from pretty good to really good, but there's some stuff in this section that isn't so great. This Major Ivanov could not more obviously be a lying villain if he walked in twirling his mustache after tying a damsel to the train tracks up ahead. And so far we haven't even seen him. We don't know if he has a mustache or not, but we can still draw some pretty solid conclusions. We can also conclude that Miller, who remains optimistic and ridiculously oblivious to the villainy afoot, is going to be seriously disappointed when we get to the Ark. That said, even though the fact that there's something deeply wrong here is absurdly obvious, the journey to the Ark is ominously foreboding. You're making the trip with Anna, Miller, and a few of the other Spartans, and even after the others start picking up on the fact that maybe this place isn't all it's cracked up to be, Miller remains stupidly upbeat. I get that his character is all about respect for authority and that he desperately wants to believe that some semblance of military command has survived, but the blindness with which he walks into the world's most obvious trap is a little too much. And the thing is, it really didn't need to be this way. If the writers hadn't been so blatant with their foreshadowing, if they'd made it a little more plausible that this Ark place was in fact the bastion of life and civilization that Miller believed it to be, there could have been a much greater narrative impact when it turns out that, no, everyone here wants you dead too. And I don't find the reason that everyone wants you dead to be particularly compelling or even interesting really. Turns out it's just that old post-apocalyptic chestnut, a cannibal cult. I've never really liked this trope of post-apocalyptic fiction. Maybe I'm a dewy-eyed optimist, but I don't think that even after a world-ending cataclysm would people create a society actively based on the consumption of human flesh. I'm sure that cannibalism would happen, no doubt. Faced between the choice of starvation and chomping on someone's leg, I might well choose the latter. And I'm sure some people without much moral fibre wouldn't object to removing that leg from someone that was still using it. But a cult based around cannibalism? I just don't think it would happen. If you take the time to find some of the diary entries scattered around, you find out that there is some explanation for it. Apparently they started eating human meat purely out of desperation, but their brains were infested by prions and they all went mad. And I know that prion thing and the subsequent madness is actually something that can happen in the real world, but I still don't really buy it. I mean, from a purely practical standpoint, humans make for terrible livestock. It takes so much time and resources to grow them to a point where they're worth butchering. It's just unsustainable. Yeah, I'm starting to wonder if I've thought about this too much. One thing you don't have to think about too much though is what happens once the cannibal's carnal desires are revealed. This section of the game stands in stark contrast to what's come before. There is no need for stealth here, and if you're spending time pondering the moral quandary of whether you should kill that cannibal or just incapacitate him, he's probably already eaten your nose and made a rich creamy sauce out of your brains for dessert. So it's just mindless killing from this point on. And gameplay wise, I'm fine with that. This is quite a short section, so it doesn't drag on, and it's a refreshing change to just be plunged into all-out carnage. But narrative-wise, yeah, I don't think this is a high point of the game. There's also a blatant hint that Anna's lungs are kind of in trouble after taking that hit from the poison gas in the last chapter, so no one's going to be too surprised when that little narrative thread develops. Well, all the characters are going to be surprised, but that's their fault for not paying attention to the plot. The player, though, will probably be able to see it coming. Anyway, Miller is naturally pretty distraught that this Ark he'd pinned his hopes to turned out to be a cannibal kill box. But he gets a boost when someone suggests that if they had access to recent satellite imagery, they could figure out which parts of the country have been least affected by the radiation and general destruction, and head there. Apparently there was a satellite station on the Caspian Sea that might have the data they need, so for lack of a better idea, that's where we're headed next. This section, like the last, provides a pretty big contrast to what we've seen before. It's another large open area like the Volga River, but whereas that environment was grey, wet and profoundly bleak, we're now under a bright baking sun in a bone-dry desert. And it's another triumph for this game's graphics engine. Again, it's not that the textures are particularly sharp or the 3D models are particularly sophisticated, it's just that they're all well designed and thoughtfully implemented, and bathed in that same high standard lighting and supplemented with gorgeous environmental effects. The dust storm that rolls in is a great example of this, although it has to be said that the way some of the larger particles just materialise from thin air is a little off-putting. This was also around the time I discovered the joys of pyromania, which looks particularly nice in the dim light. Or horrifying, I guess, if you're not a psychopath like me. The main conflict at the heart of this chapter comes from the fact that, as well as wanting to find a satellite station that may have the info you need, you really need to restock on fuel and water for both the train and your human comrades. There's a local warlord known as the Baron who has ample supplies of what you need, and he's noticed your arrival. And as it turns out, he's an oil baron, as the local area is littered with pools of crude oil, some of which cast burning geysers into the night sky. And also into the day sky, I guess, but that doesn't look as impressive. You make radio contact with a woman named Gyul, who occupies a lighthouse which just happens to be adjacent to the satellite station you need access to. So, for purely altruistic reasons that have nothing to do with her proximity to where you need to be, you agree to help her defend against the Baron soldiers, who are currently laying siege to the lighthouse. So, you and fellow Spartan Demir make your way there, stealthily sweep through the enemy's forces like a tiger from the shadows, and then the game crashes. Well, it did for me anyway. And unfortunately this was just the start of the technical issues that plagued me all the way through the rest of the game. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but I guess this crash corrupted my save game somehow. So the next time I started the game, it just crashed again immediately, leaving me with this half-loaded image in the wrong resolution. But the time after that, it just got stuck when trying to load the main menu. After a lot of messing around and experimenting, I realised that the Xbox for Windows app was trying to show me a dialog box saying that my cloud saves were different from my locally stored saves, and asking which ones I wanted to use. But the problem was the dialog box was behind the game window, and I could only see it once I'd forced the game to close. There was absolutely no way I could figure out to get to it while the game was running, and therefore no way I could actually progress to the title screen, since it always came back once I restarted the game. I tried everything I could to get the game to run in windowed mode so I could switch to the dialog box, but nothing worked. Now, I'm totally prepared to admit that I'm not particularly knowledgeable about troubleshooting stuff like this, so maybe there was an easy solution I missed. But I'm sure I'm not the only one who would have been seriously frustrated by a game-breaking bug like this. In the end, after much experimentation, I found out that I could use Task Manager to force the dialog box to close, and eventually the game might start working. But sometimes I had to force it to close a dozen times or more, and sometimes the game didn't start anyway. It got to the point where every time I wanted to load the game, I had to allow for an extra 20 or 30 minutes to get it going. And several times I got to within a hair's breadth of saying to myself, screw it, and just making this a video about how I was defeated by Metro Exodus's technical issues. But always at the last moment it started working, so I did manage to see it through to the end. Which I'm happy about because it is a good game, but man, it's not helping itself with issues like this. And looking around at other comments on the internet, I'm not the only one who had serious issues, especially with the Windows Store version. But that's the version I had free access to, so that's the one I was stuck with. Anyway, once I did manage to get the game functioning again and save Gyul, she was able to provide access to the satellite station. In fact, it turns out her mother used to work there, so she's able to direct us right to where we need to go. Of course, it's not that simple, as the station has a nasty case of crabs, or scorpions, or whatever these things are supposed to be. This is another part of the game with some survival horror overtones, as the station is mostly dark and the creatures here are sensitive to light, and can be turned away by shining your torch at them. Or by just, setting them on fire. They're pretty sensitive to that too. Provided you can avoid getting your face eaten off, it's not too tough to find the satellite maps you are seeking. And after that, you're presented with the opportunity to explore the area and maybe knock off some side quests. There's a sniper in a nearby tower you can take down, which rewards you with a nice new rifle to play around with, and an old, mostly dismantled oil tanker that houses a bunch of slaves that you can free, which rewards you with, the warm fuzzy feeling of doing a good deed, I guess. When you've had enough fun looting bandit camps, it's time for you and Demir to turn your minds, and your guns, to the next objective, liberating a water truck and its precious liquid cargo from one of the Baron's strongholds. The best way to get there is through an expansive cave system, and according to Gyul, these caves were once home to a stalwart group of survivors. There's a bit more character development here, and it's done surprisingly well. Demir says he was originally from this part of Kazakhstan and tells you he'd hoped that, against all odds, he might be able to find his family here. But seeing how desolate this place is and how effectively the Baron has taken over this land, he accepts that his family is not here and that he will almost certainly never see them again. There's another little touch here that I absolutely loved, although I'm not even sure it's intentional, and this is going to be me at my most pretentious, so feel free to skip ahead a few minutes if you want. Within these caves you come across this painting done by former inhabitants, which I strongly suspect is a reference to one of the greatest works by possibly my favourite painter, Ilya Repin. It doesn't look exactly the same, sure, but the similar composition and the fact that Repin was Ukrainian, like the developers of Metro Exodus, makes me pretty confident that this was deliberate. What makes me even more confident is the letter that can be found nearby, in which a man asks his friend to create a painting in response to the Baron's demands for surrender. I would honestly be surprised if this wasn't a reference to perhaps Ilya Repin's most famous work, The Reply of the Zaporizhian Cossacks. This painting depicts the Cossacks laughing uproariously as they try to write the most defiant, vulgar and insulting reply they can to a sultan who has demanded they surrender. The parallels are pretty obvious, and again I'd be really surprised if this wasn't an intentional reference to Repin. I suspect the painting mentioned in this letter may actually exist somewhere in the game, but if it does, I missed it. Anyway, now I've shown off my minuscule knowledge of late 19th century Russian art, back to the game. Once you're through the caves, it's time to launch an assault on the stronghold. Stealth might be an option here, but I didn't take it, at least not once the very first guy I tried to sneak up on spotted me and caused a ruckus. I did at least avoid killing any slaves. I guess you could say I'm the world's greatest humanitarian. With that done, it's time to assault the Baron's fortress and get the coal you need to keep the train going. You've actually proved to the Baron that you're enough of a pain in the ass to be taken seriously, and he orders his men to stand down and lets you walk in to negotiate. I'm not exactly sure how this is supposed to go. I assume you end up having to kill everyone anyway, but maybe there's an option to get out of there without bloodshed. But if there is, I didn't make it that far. I saw this guy getting ready to beat a slave half to death, so of course I intervened. Like I said, I'm the world's greatest humanitarian. Plus, I like crushing skulls. And apparently I wasn't quite discreet enough, because a moment later every single inhabitant of that fortress was out for my blood. They don't get it though. Well, not much of it at least. Before long they're all dead, including the Baron, who cops one to the dome courtesy of Anna. Demir stays behind to help reclaim his homeland, so I end up one Spartan short. Apparently, if I'd been more virtuous and completed more side quests and maybe murdered fewer innocents, he would have stayed with us. But at least he's alive, so I can accept this outcome. And that's the end of this section. Time for another interlude. We're on our way to a region in the east that, according to the satellite maps, might be relatively free of radiation. And there's a joyous occasion to be celebrated. Anna starts coughing up blood. No, wait, that comes after. My notes may have got a bit confused there. Give me a sec. Right, here it is. There's a joyous occasion to be celebrated. Stepan and Katya get married. And then Anna starts coughing up blood, literally seconds later. Honestly, some women just can't stand to have the attention taken off them. Regardless of Anna's selfishness, everyone is concerned for her. But Miller's eternal optimism still shines through, and he believes the clear forest air will somehow repair Anna's lungs. The fact that the last time he let his optimism get the best of him, he and his men almost ended up as a variety of small hors d'oeuvres on a cannibal's tasting plate doesn't seem to enter into his equations. There's also another musical interlude here, and again I found it genuinely moving.
Полковник Васин приехал на фронт со своей молодой женой. Полковник Васин созвал свой полк и сказал им: пойдем домой. Мы ведем войну уже 70 лет, нас учили, что жизнь это бой. Но по новым данным разведки мы воевали сами с собой.
Nobody can do rousing but melancholy folk tunes like the Russians. Then it's on to the next chapter. This is another big shift in terms of environment, and another chance for the game to show off its ability to create a diverse range of atmospheres. We've had snowbound cityscapes, bleak bogs, bright sandy deserts, and now we get verdant wooded wilderness. Artyom and Alyosha scout ahead, in the railcar, along a track that seems a bit too dilapidated to take the Aurora, and of course it takes a matter of minutes for things to go wrong in this otherwise idyllic mountain paradise. A giant creature, apparent only by its mighty roar, causes a landslide that sends the railcar into the river, and Artyom and Alyosha along with it. Artyom is rescued by a mysterious woman in a scary mask who leaves him confused, lost, and without any weapons or companions. And what is it with this game and being helped by mysterious young women? This is the third chapter in a row where you very quickly meet a young woman who guides you through the local area. There's plenty of variety in the game otherwise, in its environments and characters. It seems kind of odd that they keep coming back to this particular trope. This chapter is different to the previous two in other ways, however. It's another open environment, but to nowhere near the same extent, as your adventure essentially takes you up one side of the river and then down the other, without any real backtracking or side quests. There are still plenty of expansive areas and complex structures to explore, but on the whole this chapter is a sort of hybrid of linear and open world action. Almost immediately you're presented with a crossbow, which acts as a replacement for your air rifle, as it allows you to kill stealthily as well as fire incendiary arrows. It's a satisfying weapon to use, but I actually didn't get a lot of use out of it in this section, because I was usually motivated to go for non-lethal combat options, largely because this section has a relatively coherent and fleshed out narrative, and I didn't really want to kill anyone. The narrative here is actually helped by the fact that your progress through the area is mostly linear, as it allows for more structured and well-paced storytelling. Once you've got your crossbow, you come across a scout camp. It's long deserted now, but there's enough reading material around for you to learn that when the bombs dropped decades ago, this place became the permanent home of the children there, as well as the sole adult who remained, who came to be known solely as Teacher, and came almost to be venerated by some of the children. And as those children grew into adulthood, they began to call themselves the Children of the Forest, and formed their own little society, complete with warring factions. Eventually they abandoned the camp altogether to create makeshift townships in the surrounding wilderness. In terms of story, this may be the best part of the game, and not just because it's a little more coherent than what's come before. It's genuinely interesting to see how the children have forged their own complete civilization in microcosm, and how, despite the fact they're now adults, their civilization retains both the naivety and callous brutality of the playground. The two warring factions consist of the pirates, an aggressive group of isolationists who tend to shoot on sight, and the pioneers, who can also be aggressive, but have a rudimentary judicial system and prefer violence as a last resort. And in truth they're not precisely at war with each other, as there are some in each faction who still remember the time when they were united under the teacher's teachings. So I went into this section with the best of intentions, and determined not to murder any of the poor young whippersnappers. Can you guess what happened next? Yep, I immediately messed up as soon as I tried to infiltrate the first camp, thanks to the fact I forgot to turn off my flashlight, and thus instantly alerted everyone to my presence. So I ended up murdering everyone here, but I did it with an apologetic smile on my face. I'm sure they appreciated that. And in any case, they get their chance for some revenge a little later, when I get strung up in a net by the pirates. Fortunately, I'm saved by a giant, hideously mutated bear-like creature. This cuddly little fellow does the killing for me this time, so my conscience is clear. Well, clearish. This bear, known as the Master of the Forest, essentially serves as your nemesis in this chapter, as he, or possibly she, turns up on a couple of occasions to act as a boss fight. And as boss fights go, they're okay, but not great. The bear is certainly an impressive beast, but the fights boil down to avoiding its charges while doing your best to set it on fire. This is definitely a good time to have a full stock of Molotov cocktails. Being on fire seems to distract the bear, and, well, I can't blame it. I'm pretty sure I'd find it a little tough to focus if my flesh was being charbroiled too. So, while it's distracted, you can just fill it full of lead, and in the first fight it'll just wander off, seemingly none the worse for wear despite the 100 or so bullets now lodged in its body, or the fact that said body is now too well done for even the most uncultured steak enthusiasts. And in the second and final fight, you still have to stab it in the eye and throw it into the river before it gives up for good. But that comes later. Before that, you have to find your way through a pioneer's settlement, which bears quite a similarity to an Ewok village from Star Trek. Yes, I know that's wrong. I just find it constantly amusing to deliberately confuse Star Trek and Lord of the Rings. Gameplay-wise, this is another highlight, as it really lets you put all your stealthy tricks and abilities to the test. And since this is the home of the relatively peaceful pioneers, I did my best not to hurt anyone, and I didn't. Well, I mean, I cracked a few skulls and damaged a few windpipes probably, and honestly there's probably not a great future in store for anyone who's been knocked unconscious and left in a forest infested with wolves, bears, mutants, and mutant bears. Actually, now I think of it, I've never seen anyone who I knocked unconscious get up and return to the land of the living. Even their bodies tend to disappear after a while. Yep, they're all dead, aren't they? They all got eaten. I'm a monster. Ah, well. Anyway, you still have to track down Alyosha, who I'd basically forgotten about by now. You push on into pirate territory, and, well, I maybe did a bit more murdering here, don't tell anyone. Eventually you'll find yourself at the church, the one you could see from the railcar right at the beginning of the chapter. There you meet Olga, the woman who pulled you from the river, and she gives you the whole rundown on the history of the Children of the Forest, how the pirates and the pioneers split into separate factions after a bandit raid spurred a spree of revenge killings. Those who encouraged or took part in the killings became pirates, while those who objected became pioneers, and Teacher, profoundly ashamed that his young charges would resort to such brutal revenge, secluded himself in the church and eventually took his own life. It's not the most profound or the most sophisticated writing in game history, far from it, but it does do a good job of presenting a conflicted, troubled group of people trying their best to make sense of a destroyed world, and it does it without being too overblown or self-important, and I think for that Metro Exodus should be applauded. Olga tells Artyom that Alyosha is at the dam at the head of the valley, waiting to rendezvous with the Aurora. So that's where we head. Along the way, there's a rather bizarre encounter with an odd fellow known as the Admiral, who was once the pirate's second-in-command, but now lives in total isolation in an old sawmill. Well, I guess he's not in total isolation, he still has a couple of companions, but they don't do much talking, at least not of their own accord. Oh, and he has a parrot, which does actually do some talking on occasion. This guy actually reminds me of Crichton from Red Dwarf, which is a reference a lot of people might not get, so I guess I'll have to include a clip. You get another chance to play the guitar, and the poor, sad psychopath eventually falls asleep. He's actually kind of a sympathetic character. Well, up to the point he reveals that he's the one responsible for his companion's cadaverous state. When you finally meet Alyosha near the dam, he delivers some bad news. The dam is in a really bad way, it's inevitably going to break in the very near future. And even worse, when it does, it's going to let loose an avalanche of radioactive sediment, so the valley will not only become very damp, it will also become very irradiated. So there's no point in the Aurora stopping here, we need to push on into the east. And that's what we do once the aforementioned final fight with the bear is out of the way. Olga and Alyosha reluctantly part ways, with the latter swearing to return one day. And who knows, maybe you will. Not in this game though, because now it's time for the final chapter of Metro Exodus. Anna is very near death now, and her only hope lies in the faint possibility that the dead city of Novosibirsk contains a medicine that can repair her damaged lungs. There is some basis for this hope, as the city was once a beacon of medical ingenuity and experimental research. But finding it isn't going to be easy. Novosibirsk hasn't faced the same physical destruction of Moscow, but the radiation here is many times stronger. So Miller and Artyom gear up with the strongest radiation shielding they can lay hands on, and go into the city while the other Spartans head to a nearby engineering depot that may contain a snowplow for the Aurora, which will be a real necessity as winter draws in once again. And so the game has now come full circle. It started in a hostile frozen urban wasteland, and it ends in one. But this place is more desolate even than Moscow, as there is no sign of human life at all. Well, almost none. Miller and Artyom happen upon a young boy named Kirill who proclaims himself to be a private in the OSCOM Rapid Response Unit, whatever that is. He tells them that for a long time people were able to survive here in the Novosibirsk metro thanks to an experimental anti-radiation drug, but as supplies dwindled so did the population until it was just Kirill and his father. And now the boy's father is missing in action after undertaking a mission to the nearby satellite communications centre. Miller sees this as another opportunity to find a map of a potentially habitable part of the world, so after taking the last of the anti-radiation drug, he decides to track down the father, while Artyom goes to the Medical Research Institute in the hopes of finding the medicine Anna so desperately needs. We're into the final hour of the game now, and I'm genuinely sorry to say that it's a bit of a letdown. This final section starts off well enough, with an incredibly creepy trek through the darkest reaches of the metro. This whole area seems to be infested with some sort of leech-like creatures that have transformed every surface into a writhing, gelatinous mess of goo. The environment is genuinely disconcerting, as is the way the giant leeches slither through the darkness right at the edge of your vision. After that though, things go downhill, in my opinion at least, and the very final section of the game is a bit of an anticlimax. The radiation is having strange effects on your senses, and Anna appears from nowhere to encourage you on. There are other hallucinations too. There are strange shadowy figures, items seem to float in the air, lights and sounds come from impossible places. All of this might have been rather effective and genuinely disturbing in another context, but here it just slows down your progress and makes it harder to navigate the dark, confusing environment. The bigger problem though is the enemies that are present here. There's only one type, these giant ape-like creatures, presumably mutated versions of the animals that were kept here for the purposes of experimentation. They're big bullet sponges and not particularly interesting to fight, and in fact they're very much like slightly smaller versions of the mutated bear from the previous chapter. Worst of all, when you find the medicine, there's one final encounter with one of these blind ape mutants, but you don't even get to do anything other than mash buttons for a couple of QuickTime events. I always find it disappointing when a game deprives you of any real agency at crucial moments, and this is a particularly egregious example. The QuickTime events up till now have been handled fairly well, but this one just goes a bit too far. Miller finds you on the edge of death and heroically gives you his dose of the experimental anti-radiation drug. You fall unconscious and wake up a while later in the back of the van, with Kirill at the wheel and Miller slumped and unresponsive. Kirill has no idea how to drive, so your final task in this game is to navigate through the dark, snowbound streets towards a place you can rendezvous with the Aurora. This scene, at least, I like very much, particularly the way the Aurora barges its way into the shot. And then the Spartans come bounding towards their fallen comrade. But in terms of gameplay, I really think something more could have been done with the game's climax. I'm not sure what that something might have been, and you might think it's therefore unfair of me to be so critical, but hey, I'm some random YouTube curmudgeon, it's my job. So, it's time for the end sequence. Miller's dead, but somehow more talkative than ever. Artyom gets blood transfusions from his comrades, and apparently if you lost too many of them along the way, you get the bad ending, in which Artyom doesn't quite get enough blood and dies after all. I only left one of them behind, so I guess I qualify for the good ending. And I have to say I really love this touch. Not only does it make some small amount of sense, it's also strongly tied to the central themes of camaraderie and keeping your friends and family safe. And by the end of your long trek, your friends really are your family. You all gather on a hill overlooking Lake Baikal to farewell Colonel Miller, and Artyom is voted in as the new commander of the Spartans. Hooray! And that's it. The credits roll, the game is over. I really couldn't help but feel that, after such a long, eventful and meaningful journey, I'd earned a better look at what sort of life awaited Artyom and the Spartans at the end of it all. This is one game that I think really needed an epilogue chapter of some sort. And honestly, coming from someone like me who very rarely cares enough about characters in games to want to know what happens to them, that's quite a compliment. If I was feeling cynical, I might suggest that this was a deliberate ploy on behalf of the developers in order to increase sales for the DLC. I haven't played any of the DLC packs, but one of them takes place after the events of the game and follows the American Spartan Sam as he tries to make his way back to California. I would definitely have liked to play that, if only in the hopes it would give me a glimpse into the lives of the characters after the end of their journey. Well, and also because I like this game a lot and wouldn't mind having more of it to play. The other DLC apparently lets you take on the role of Miller and experience the final section of the game from his perspective, leading up to his eventual self-sacrifice and subsequent death. And I would definitely have liked to experience that too, as I thought it was a bit disappointing to have Miller die while Artyom was unconscious. Maybe it would have been cheesy to see Miller take his last heroic breaths, but after all we'd been through together, I was honestly sad not to have been there for him at the end. So yes, add Metro Exodus to the list of games where the ending doesn't quite live up to everything that's come before. It's quite a long list, unfortunately. But it's a list that also contains many genuinely good games, and this is one of them. The gameplay is solid, and there's a lot of depth to the combat and the survival elements for those who care to seek it out. But the two main reasons I'll remember Metro Exodus are the high quality environmental design and the fact that it presents a simple, compelling story well told. And that is increasingly rare in games these days, I find. Maybe I'm just getting jaded and cynical, but to my mind games too often either contain simple, boring stories, well told, or complex, interesting stories, badly told. The story of Metro Exodus doesn't need a lot of words, it doesn't need overly dramatic set pieces. It just takes its central theme and sticks to it, subtly but strongly. I mean, it's not always subtle, it's right there in the title after all. But the Exodus is only 1/3 of the story. After that comes the journey, and then the homecoming. It's a shame that the developers didn't choose to focus a little more on that third element. I think one final chapter could have made this one of the best games of the generation. But as for the Exodus and the subsequent journey through a shattered world, few games have done it better. Well, thanks for watching this way too long video. I hope you got something out of it. If you did, please consider liking this video or subscribing if you haven't already, and feel free to leave a comment telling me that I'm the greatest YouTuber on the planet, or that I'm the most tedious windbag in history, or anything in between. Until next time though, get off my lawn.
Я видел генералов, они пьют и едят нашу смерть. Их дети сходят с ума от того, что им нечего больше хотеть. А земля лежит в ржавчине, церкви смешались с золой. И если мы хотим, чтобы было куда вернуться, время вернуться домой. Этот поезд в огне, и нам не на что больше жать. Этот поезд в огне, и нам некуда больше бежать. Эта земля была нашей, пока мы не увязли в борьбе.